Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Memoria rerum gestarum, literally the memory of deeds, is yet another way of saying history, in the sense both of collective memory, tradition, and of history writing. Memory and time are important concepts, important indeed in all four of the major Latin historians whom we are going to be treating, Sallust, Livy, Tacitus, and Ammianus Marcellinus, but perhaps most of all for Livy, uh, whose history must have consumed all of his working life, and when intact, spanned the period from the sack of Troy through to the writer's own day. He signals the importance of time from the start of his preface, which was published together with the first unit of his history. Factor rusne operae pretium sim, sia primordio urbis res populi Romani per scripserim, nec satescio, nec sisciam dicere ausem. Ut cumque erit, iuabit tamen rerum gestarum memoriae principis terrarum populi pro virili parte et ipsum consuluisse. Whether I will do something worthwhile if I write a detailed record of the deeds of the Roman people from the origin of the city, I do not really know, nor if I knew, would I dare to say so. However that may be, it will nevertheless please me to have taken thought, to the best of my ability, for the history of the greatest nation in the world. The tenses of the sentences quoted here, factorus sim erit iuabit, all in the future, put Livy's own potential literary achievement and resulting profit from it firmly in the future. This preface looks ahead towards the moment of publication and indeed beyond, to the reaction readers will have to his book. Yet the force of the past is firmly felt here as well. It is memory, memoria rerum gestarum, with which Livy concerns himself, and that concern is imagined as having already happened, the perfect infinitive consuluisse that ends the passage I here have quoted. The preface is therefore written as if from the simultaneous vantage points of one looking ahead and of one looking back on a task already completed. However, as he continues, it is clear that the present has an ambiguous status in Livy's thought, a status which is perhaps most easily understood if we contrast his treatment of it with those of his most famous precursor and successor. In the latter, in Tacitus, the present represents a safe place from which the writer and his readers can look back on political dangers safely negotiated. Tacitus speaks of the felicitas temporum, the good fortune of the times, in his opening passage of Agricola 3:1. That blessed present in which one can speak and write what one feels. It is also a time which Tacitus promises one day to celebrate in his history, as he mentions in Historiae 1:1-4. Instead, of course, though, he famously keeps moving backwards, away from the present, into the dark and corrupt past. Each work of his, especially the Historiae and the Annales, moves farther away from the emperors Nerva and Trajan, under whom Tacitus lived and worked. And if we look at the predecessor of Livy, that is Sallust, the present is a time of deep corruption and disappointment. Political and social institutions alike are rotting away, and preferment goes only to those who do not deserve it, as he mentions in his Bellum Catilinae 10:6 and 11:3, his Bellum Jugurthinum 3:1 and 4:4. On the other hand, Sallust's own personal present is also a time of safety and retirement, since he had withdrawn from politics when he was writing, and so, like Tacitus, is in a place from which he can survey the past in relative security. With Sallust's help, his readers similarly are able to step back from contemporary corruption, therefore, and to learn the salutary lessons that he claims his history will provide. He mentions this in Bellum Jugurthinum 4. Now, Livy's present is more Sallustian than Tacitian. Like the earlier historian, he implicitly claims early on that his work will benefit the state, The verb with which he describes what he does, consuluisse, again here in this passage, is the same verb with which the Romans regularly describe what magistrates do, particularly consuls. You can hear the word consul inside of that verb. In fact, the very word consul, the title, derives from this idea of taking thought for or consulting the state. Like Sallust, too, Livy withdraws from this present, but rather than retiring from contemporary politics so as to write about them, in the early books he has turned away to study the past, what he calls prisca illa in his preface, to the study of those early pristine times. His readers, in contrast, less interested in ancient history, no doubt hasten toward the present, as he mentions actually in his preface, festinantibus ad haec nova, they are hastening to these new things. And therefore, his elaborate and careful defense in his preface of the utility and the pleasure to be derived from the study of the ancient past makes sense. He has to kind of make some apology for, in the sense of defense, for why one should study the past. And he does so by saying, as the preface continues, that we learn that history is salubre ac frugiferum, that is healthy and fruitful. It is medicinum, a remedium for the res republica in its present sickness. The usefulness, however, will come from Livy's own and his readers' contemplation of the past, which through a fall in discipline has itself been in a process of decline from an ancient, though unspecified, time of health and expansion to Livy's own day, in which the Romans can neither bear their diseases nor their cures, as he says very pointedly in his preface. The preface then offers us a more complex picture of the past, present, and future, and of the relationship between writer and reader. More complicated, I think, than is offered by either Sallust or Tacitus's work. It is a complicated mix of focal points, Livy's seemingly contradictory desires being both to escape from the here and now and to fix contemporary ills by confronting the past. History and the future come together in the troubled present. Only by means of memory can the present, and by implication the future, the time of both publication and of reading, only by means of memory can the present be cured. Only by understanding the past can his readers hope to escape the cycle of decline and death in which they are enmeshed. Time figures not only in Livy's programmatic statements in the preface, but throughout his work. Two aspects are particularly important. First, the historical period that Livy chooses to cover, the form of time, as it were. And second, the way in which he uses time and memory within his history, that is, we might call it the content of time. Though his work is called Ab Urbe Condita, from the foundation of the city, his history actually begins some 400 years earlier with the fall of Troy. As he says in his very opening words of the first book, Iam primum omnium satis constat Troia capta. First of all, it is generally agreed that after the capture of Troy, and then he goes on. According to one version, that capture represented the beginning of Rome, and so Livy uses it. The Trojan hero Aeneas arrives in Latium, cements an alliance with the local king, and within 3 chapters of Livy, Romulus and Remus, the future founders of Rome, are born. Time, therefore, telescopes. Of the years between the traditional date for the fall of Troy, which is 1184, and that for the founding of Rome, that is the year 753, the first few are treated at some length. Aeneas and his son Ascanius, for instance, together with the 2 cities they found, Lavinium and Alba Longa. Those get chapters 1 through 3 between them. But all the generations between Ascanius and the twins' grandfather are collapsed into a mere 12 lines of Oxford classical text. That would be Livy, Book 1, Chapter 3, 6 through 9. Romulus and Remus themselves receive comparatively generous treatment up through Romulus's death in Book 1, Chapter 16, and from this point on, time stretches. The history moves forward at an increasingly slow pace, both teasing and gratifying the readers who are hurrying ahead. One book for the first 250 years of Rome's existence, 4, though, for the next 120, and 5 for the next 97. And it goes on, so on, until he reached his own time, in which Livy was covering only about one book per year. Of course, there is another way of looking at all this. Livy told us in the preface that he enjoys staying away while he can from the present, a time in which political cares can disturb, though not compromise, a historian's objectivity. He says this in line 5 of his preface. Yet time in the past is all too short. Though the Ab Urbe Condita illustrates what modern scholars call an expansion of the past, and it tells in great detail of a long vanished and undocumented period, Livy's treatment of the early history of Rome is less expansive than some other historians. As his history continues, it becomes ever more detailed, ever more inclusive. The claims of the present are insistent. The closer he comes to his own time, the more he must tell. And it is not certain that he ever finished. The Ab Urbe Condita originally had 142 books, probably published in groups of 5, which scholars refer to as pentads, and then going up to the year 9, those would have gone up to the year 9 BC. We are not sure, however, whether that date was Livy's chosen stopping point. It is not an obvious stopping point, though a case has been made for its appropriateness. Many scholars believe, rather, that he originally intended to stop with the death of Cicero in book 120, and that would be in the year 43 BC, but then changed his mind and continued on through the Augustan period. Such an extension, kind of ad hoc, is attested for the historian Polybius, also for the epic poet Ennius, and for the late antique historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who, as I said, we will be devoting some time to at the end of our course. However, it is not clear whether Livy himself would have thought of these latter books as an addition. His statement, reported by the elder Pliny, that he would have stopped earlier, but his, quote, restless spirit fed on the work, end quote, suggests that he would simply have kept on working as long as he could. He would probably never, we will probably never know the truth, but it is not implausible that whatever Livy may have intended when he began his history, the end point of the Ab Urbe Condita was incessantly deferred as Roman history moved on and the history of Rome moved with it. History could not come to a full stop, since, in a sense, the Roman Imperium defined time as it defined space. From Livy's perspective, history, from the very beginning of the historical period, that is, from the Trojan War, was Roman history, as the civilized world was Roman territory. Time within the Ab Urbe Condita also requires a dual perspective. It is always past, that is, of course, history after all. Yet it is also always seen from the present, always filtered through the perspective of the reader. As one popular history of England once put it, quote, history is not what you thought, it is what you can remember. All other history defeats itself, end quote. But what matters is not only what you remember, or how and why. Livy is explicit about the memoria rerum gestarum, and what is it really for? He says, my concern is that each reader should pay keen attention to these things. What kind of life, what kind of character the Romans had, through what kind of men and by what means power was both acquired and expanded at home and abroad. Then, as discipline tottered a little, let him follow that character in his mind as it began to fall apart, so to speak. Then, as it collapsed more and more, then began to rush headlong, until we have come to these times in which we can endure neither our faults nor their remedies. This is, in fact, an especially healthy and fruitful element of the study of history, that you contemplate object lessons of every type of model set up in a perspicuous monument. Thence for yourself and your state you can choose what to imitate, thence what to avoid. If it is loathsome in its beginning, loathsome in its outcome. Now, as we've already seen, Livy thinks of history in general, and in particular, that is his book, as medicine for the state. In his preface, line 10, he explains how that medicine is to work. He says, History is a monumentum, as we read here, a word which can denote either a physical structure or a literary work. And it is crucially illuminated here by the Latin adjective illustre, perspicuous or famous. It literally means bright or pervaded by light. History is useful only, therefore, if it is visible. On the monument further are exempla, again, a word which can be used of physical copies, but which more often denote a literary or moral, even ethical precedent or pattern. Yet, given the stress of preface 9 that we've read here on people, vita, mores, viri, and artes all apply to human actors, it is inevitable that we think of this monument as a structure containing or supporting images of people. If the structure is well lit, then these images, these statues, as it were, are situated in full public view, where they can be carefully inspected. In terms of ancient literary theory, the metaphor implies that Livy's narrative will be clear, immediate, vivid, and it will make us see the events in our mind's eye. But it also implies that we will feel the emotions and understand the thoughts and motives of the actors from inside, as it were. This clarity and immediacy are not simply decorative, however. This monument is there explicitly to be useful, to be healthy and fruitful, as I've said, and not just for anyone, but for you. Tibi tuaeque rei publicae is a striking phrase, which suggests that Livy is thinking about his potential reader not simply as an individual, but as a citizen. By looking carefully at the monument, that is, by reading Livy's history attentively, by understanding its representations, distinguishing good and ill, and then by implementing that understanding, you, the reader, the citizen reader, make history work. The ab urbe condita is not simply the past preserved in amber. It is a record of deeds that you must use, imitating the good and avoiding the bad. In turn, if you get it right, this imitation and avoidance will provide a cure for the current evils of your state. History, therefore, is effective only when it becomes present. The process by which the reader comes to learn from and apply the lessons of history is double. In Preface 10, the phrase omnis exempli documenta, object lessons of every type of model that we've just read. This is not a tautology, as it may first appear. Documentum, which is from the same root as docere, that is the verb to teach, means something with which the word documentum means something with which one can teach. An exemplum, on the other hand, is something that is or can be copied. In Latin, the word came to mean specifically a famous story or action or character that is held up as a specimen to others. And what this sentence suggests, then, is that the reader and historian must cooperate. The latter serves as a guide and a teacher, the former not passively absorbing lessons, but as an active learner. As the characters in the ab urbe condita work to understand the learner, understand the implications and demands of their own historical situation, so the reader, who is also a citizen, is a res publica himself. He is somebody who evaluates, judges, and acts according to the lessons of the past. Time and memory, then, provide the material from which we can benefit if we read Livy. According to the adage, those who do not understand history are doomed to repeat it. Yet in Livian history, it seems that you are precisely encouraged, at least in the case of good Exempla, to repeat the past. Such an assumption has led generations of scholars to characterize Livy as one who looks constantly to the good old days, wishing for their return, scorning the modern world, as it were. The matter is not so simple, though. As we've seen, though acknowledging the pull of the past, Livy's ab urbe condita moves ahead eagerly. The past may be pleasurable as a retreat and a source of historical knowledge, but it is only really useful as a tool. Recent studies have emphasized that Livy's exempla serve not as immovable precedents, but rather as guides. Livian characters repeatedly deploy old patterns of behavior in new ways, use traditional arguments to uphold original, innovative proposals, revive ancient practices, and restore ancient monuments in order to strengthen the foundations on which the modern state rests. History does not merely repeat itself, but understanding history in Livy means being willing to change. And in many ways, Livy, in this regard, encapsulates this most characteristic paradox within the Roman character itself, this intense conservatism, this veneration for the past, this kind of sense of having a sacred, awe of what has gone before, but yet also a continual willingness to a change and to adapt as circumstances deem fit. A central aspect of the passage of the preface that I've quoted and discussed now at length has come to the fore in Livyan studies over the past 50 years or so, and that is the comparison of the ab urbe condita to an architectural structure. In his famous discussion of history in the De Oratore, Cicero refers to the ex aedificatio, or building up of a work of history. Livy, in writing his narrative, seems to have had the same sort of metaphor in mind. In addition to his highly developed skill at creating and managing literary architectonics, Livy, it has been argued, draws upon a specific and particularly Roman model for his literary architecture. Roman literary education was primarily practical and rhetorical, in the sense that it taught students, many of whom would go on to be political orators, to use words as persuasive tools. As such, it devoted a great deal of time to training the mind to assimilate, to categorize, and to deploy a complex system of conventional motifs and general topics on which one could build a specific argument. These motifs and topics, which range from different types of captatio benevolentiae, that is, ways of winning over an audience, to variations on the theme of the just, for example, we should pity suppliants, to means of discrediting an opponent, are discussed in ancient rhetorical treatises, such as the anonymous early 1st century BC Rhetorica ad Herennium. The rhetorical nature of Roman education and thought was pervasive. Though designed primarily for oratory, these topics are found in all types of literature. One of the most widely used means of keeping both general topics and the argument of a specific speech, for example, straighten one's memory, indeed of memorizing any complex system or long list of items, was to assign each one an appropriate image and to arrange them in a mental structure, a house, for instance, an arch, a colonnade. So the Rhetorica ad Herennium talks about this in Book 3, Chapter 29, specifically. So if you want to memorize a whole long list of information, mentally imagine a house and associate one item with, say, the sink, then to the drain board next to the sink, then another one to the fridge, and to another one to the cabinet next below that, or whatever the case may be. Each physical item would then remind the student of the required literary or rhetorical topic. So memory was spatial, memory was architectural. That's kind of the point I'm driving at. And Livy seems to have thought about the objects that made up his history, the events and the actors, in a way similar to that in which Romans thought about memory structures. The images at the beginning of Book 6, for example, are not unlike those of the anonymous author of the Rhetorica ad Herennium in his description of how to organize topics. Compare, for instance, Livy's claim to have narrated the deeds of the Romans in 5 books, quote, deeds that are obscured by too much antiquity, like things which are barely visible from a long distance. But now the deeds that follow will be set out more clearly and more accurately from the second origin of the city. And then you compare that with, as he goes on, then the backgrounds ought to be neither too bright nor too dim, so that the shadows may not obscure the images, nor the luster make them glitter. The intervals between backgrounds should be of moderate extent. For like the external eye, Livy says, so the inner eye of thought is less powerful when you have moved the object of sight too near or too far away, end quote. That is all very similar to what the Rhetorical ad Herennium says in its work on in its reference to mental objects and associating them with memory. We can imagine, therefore, the monument of Praefatio Decimum, that is the 10th line of the preface, as something like a Roman forum, with statues arranged around and in it. Both the statues and the structures in which they are set are important, but the individual episodes and the narratives as a whole matter. Livy is not alone in making such a close association between memoria, history, and physical monuments, though he may be alone in extending it to the form of a written history. But his use of the association is enhanced and facilitated by the Romans' highly developed sense of the traditions attaching to places. For instance, Cicero, in the opening of his work De Finibus, that would be book 5, chapter 2, he makes his character Piso explain, quote, "When looking at Intuens, our Senate house, I used to think of Scipio, Cato, Laelius, and indeed in particular of my own ancestor. Places have such power of recall that not without reason is the system, disciplina, of memory taken from them." End quote. Famous monuments call to mind the stories of famous deeds and famous men. In the same way, as I've already been elucidating, from an illuminated monumentum comes memoria rerum gestarum, that can inspire living men to equal or surpass the glory of past achievements. Now, because the Ab Urbe Condita is so big, and because in its original form it covered some 750 years of Roman history, it is tempting to think of the text as a written city, one which in some ways has outlasted the physical urbs, the physical city. Such a city needs a map. That is, in narrative terms, it needs careful articulation, a structure that allows readers to make sense of where they are and to understand how one part of the city relates to another. Livy's use of narrative structure, together with his placing of significant characters and actions in counterpoise, unifies and strengthens his work, which otherwise would be in danger of collapsing from its own size. Even if one takes into account only the surviving 35 books, there is a lot of Livy. If the original 142 books were to have been at all meaningful, they had to be articulated into parts that in turn could be related one to another. The basic chronological organization that all history enjoys, the arrow of time, as it were, moving from the past to the present, is not enough to maintain the integrity of such a complex work, in which both sequential and contemporaneous actions are narrated. Livy himself, with his frequent authorial interjections, provides some guidance, and in a pioneering study by T.J. Luce, he argued that Livy exploits the pentad design, that is, grouping things by books of 5, in such a way as to shape the story and the reader's experience of that story. Now, that work came out not 50 years ago, but 1977, so a little bit over 45 years ago. And since the publication of Luce's book in 1977, readers have continued to find and illuminate architectonic structures within the Ab Urbe Condita. So, for instance, to take a relatively localized example, books 5 and 6, the juncture between the first two pentads, are part of at least two competing structures. There is a break there. And indeed, that is true. There is a break there, both in terms of form between the two published units, but there's also a break in content, because book 5 ends with the Gauls sacking Rome in the year 387, and then the start of the effort to rebuild Rome under Camillus's leadership. Whereas book 6 begins with a preface full of images of rebirth, you see. Moving backward then from the end, we find the first half of book 5 to be occupied with another kind of ending, that is, the Roman defeat of the Etruscans, which takes up the first 22 chapters of book 5, and it concludes really one phase of warfare within Italy. That ending is in turn closely followed by a new beginning. The invasion of the Gauls in the middle of the book, that would be chapter 32 of book 5, gives us a taste of what is to come in future books when Rome fights the Samnites in books 7 through 11, and then ultimately fights Carthage from books 16 to 20. The Gauls, therefore, are both a danger in themselves, but also a marker for a new kind of war. In them, the Romans face their first truly foreign enemy, one that will become paradigmatic for external terror and danger. Book 5, therefore, in many ways, turns out to be a beginning in which Livy sets the stage via the Gauls for Roman expansion outside of Latium and Etruria. Conversely, Book 6, apparently a new start, also looks backward. In it, Livy is concerned primarily with internal political struggles of the type that had preoccupied the Romans since the foundation of the Republic. This is the so-called struggle of the orders. And in the struggle of the orders, the new beginning comes only at the end of Book 6, with the opening of the consulate to the two plebeians, which takes place in the year 367 under the Liciniae Sextae leges, the laws of Liciniae Sexta. In addition to serving as narrative boundaries, however, the two books form a coherent whole on their own, linked by the person of Camillus, Rome's greatest general before Scipio Africanus. Appearing first at the beginning of Book 5, he leads the Romans against Etruscan Veii and against the Gauls, and then takes part, with mixed success, in both political and military events throughout Book 6. Therefore, in these books, we can see Livy playing with the idea of beginnings and endings via the pentad divisions, and superimposing on that play the smaller, more tightly knit unit of books 5 through 6, the life of Camillus. Now, a different kind of patterning can be seen in the third decade, that is, a group of 10 books. In this case, the second decade would be, the third decade would be books 21 through 30. Which, though clearly articulated into two pentads, essentially function as a single unit, telling the single story of the war with Hannibal. Livy announces this group of 10 books as such, as a collective unit. The preface to Book 21 contains the conventional claim that the historian subject is going to surpass all others in greatness, and thereby suggests that these books are marked off as a special unit within a larger whole. The 10 books describe a kind of arc from Hannibal's invasion of Spain and then of Italy in Book 21 via the disasters at the Ticinus River, the Trebia and Lake Trasimene, and ultimately at Cannae, Books 21 through 22. Then through to the deaths of the Scipiones in Spain, Book 25, and Hannibal's march on Rome in Book 26, which is the low point and geographical center of the whole decade. Not all in the first 5 books is disastrous, however. Fabius, Quintus Fabius Maximus, that is the dictator who was given charge of the war against Hannibal, pursues his successful delaying action, while later Marcellus takes Syracuse and wins a battle at Agrigentum, victories bracketing the tragedy in Spain. Moreover, Hannibal's march on Rome is inspired by the certainty that Capua, the Campanian city where Hannibal had wintered after his first campaign season in Italy, is about to fall to the Romans. This is mentioned in Book 26, Chapter 7. Not only does his attack on Rome come to nothing, but hard on the heels of his retreat, Livy narrates the appointment of the Spanish command, to the Spanish command of Publius Cornelius Scipio. That is Book 26, chapters 18 through 19. And the 24-year-old general will eventually go on to defeat Hannibal himself in Book 30. The major Roman defeats then are concentrated in books 21 through 22, and the first 5 books end on a mixed note. But the second 5 books open with apparent disaster avoided, and following the reversal of fortune, they continue, that reversal of fortune where a disaster is avoided, They continue on toward the final inevitable end of Roman supremacy. While there are other theaters of war, besides those in which Hannibal himself features, the narrative structure and force of the story rests with the Carthaginian general, whose initiative in the first 5 books is balanced by his retreat in the second, and whose threat is countered by the steady rise of Scipio Africanus, who replaces Quintus Fabius Maximus as the characteristic or quintessential military leader of Rome. Even this brief sketch that I've just given shows that one of the large-scale techniques with which Livy links the parts of his history is the repeated returning of the narrative focus to its main actors. The famous character sketch of Hannibal, for instance, which opens the Second Punic War in Book 21, Chapter 1. Then quickly afterwards, Livy returns to evaluate him closer to his defeat in Book 28, Chapter 12. And his opponent, Scipio, is given several brief but telling appearances, for example, saving his father's life in Book 21, Chapter 46, rallying the survivors of Cannae in Book 22, Chapter 53, before his lengthy introduction at Book 26, Chapter 18. In addition, Scipio is foreshadowed from the start by the active presence of his father, whose cavalry, even before Hannibal crosses the Alps, meets him in a skirmish that Livy labels as an omen for the war as a whole. This is Book 21, Chapter 29. The two generals themselves, however, are kept apart until the very end, where Livy brings them together before the great final battle of Zama. Their inequality there, where Livy goes on a great length about this. Their inequality is a marked contrast between, and it is marked by the difference of their speeches, where in Book 30, chapters 31 through 30 through 31, Hannibal is given a long-winded speech in which he sues for peace, and Scipio is given a very terse, brief, and unrelenting speech, which basically says no way. And this contrasts with the mutual respect with which each of the protagonists is said to profess for one for another. This is Book 30, Chapter 30. Each one of them, they begin by complimenting each other on what marvelous generals they are. These speeches, no doubt totally fictitious, really, and the reported harangues to their troops which follow, that is in Chapter 30, 32 through 33, structurally balance the paired exhortations of Scipio's father and Hannibal, all the way going back now to Book 21, Chapters 40 through 44. And they frame the war narrative as a whole. So you see, there's an architectural coherence, therefore, to this entire third decade. And we might say that with adjustments, for the larger scale, we can make the same kind of claim for architectural coherence to the entire work of Livy as a whole. And an appreciation of this is helped by the fact that Livy's readers already know, of course, the outcome of the war. While on one level, such historical knowledge threatens the interest of the narrative, right? We're not going to be surprised, by the ending. Why read it if you already know how it comes out? Nevertheless, Livy maintains the tension appropriate to such a story through his narrative immediacy, which, as one reads, enables us to suspend, at least partially, the knowledge that Rome won this and indeed every other war. Rome's overall destiny for greatness can be thwarted momentarily on the level of the individual detail, but not ultimately. So, for example, the impiety of Flamininus and the consequent disaster at Lake Trasimene could mean the end of the city, and the emotive qualities of the narrative are no less effective for the fact that we know that they did not end the city. Yet the historian plays with our awareness as well, most notably by means of narrative seeds that plant expectations of later events. One such is the cavalry skirmish on the border of Spain, as I've already mentioned. Another, which also looks ahead to the meeting of Scipio and Hannibal, is the accidental encounter of Scipio and Hasdrubal at the court of the African king Syphax in Book 28, chapters 17 through 18. Similarly, the vignette of the 18-year-old Scipio at the river Ticinus not only establishes his courage, but also lets Livy announce him as the future Africanus. That is in Book 21, chapter 46. And this cognomen, this kind of title that he acquired, Africanus, finally was granted to him in the very last sentences of the whole decade. That is in Book 30, chapter 45, lines 6 through 7. So again, Hannibal's failure to march on Rome after Lake Trasimene, that is another example of the same kind of quality, for which he is famously criticized by his lieutenant Maharbal in Book 22, chapter 51. This foreshadows Hannibal's later abortive march on the city as well. In each case, the foreshadowing and the event foreshadowed function reciprocally, their effectiveness in tying the text together depending on the reader's awareness and expectation that something like this will happen again. Each seed thus at the same time both removes suspense and generates it. A large-scale device with which Livy ties his history together is his deployment of what we might call archival material. Far from being a seamless web, Livy's narrative can be broadly characterized as a combination of episodes or stories, punctuated by two different kinds of non-narrative material. On the one hand, scholarly interventions, reports of variants, citations of sources, cross-references to other parts of the work, and so on. And on the other hand, reports of state and religious business, appointments or deaths of magistrates and priests, foundations of temples, pottages and their expiations, famines, pestilences, and so on. This material becomes increasingly more substantial as the text progresses, perhaps because Livy's sources became more detailed, but also perhaps because as the Roman state grew more complex and more organized, such events multiplied. At the beginning of the Republic, the narrative is articulated quite simply from year to year, the archival material often consisting merely of the annual elections, which are the foundation and sufficient condition for the state's continuing existence. But in later books, the years acquire a characteristic annalistic shape, beginning often with the elections and reports of prodigies, followed by events abroad, that is, military campaigns, ending with a return to Rome and more archival material, typically reports of deaths, colonies, and so on. The scholar J.W. Rich has rightly pointed out that such an organization is often more honored in the breach than in the observance. One of Livy's most characteristic moves is the modification of conventional narrative expectations, especially on the level of form, and it would be surprising to find him adhering slavishly to a pattern which provided opportunity for play. Since it is a pattern, however, and one that Livy's readers come to expect to find, it does provide a further kind of map to this written city, as the elections, military assignments, and other such events form the backbone of the state, so they form the backbone of Livy's narrative, assuring that it, like the state, moves ahead in predictable, traditional fashion. It is difficult to generalize about Livy's style. Neither as determinedly outré as Sallust, nor as obsessed with the discordant and the bizarre as Tacitus, which we will learn about in our next lecture. Livy wrote a Latin whose chief features are a certain supple variety and a love of experimentation. He varies his writing considerably to suit his subject matter, which range from wars to weddings to sedent meetings to revolutionary councils. The result was a historiographical style that became, indeed, the model for later historians, such as Curtius Rufus, Velleius Paterculus, and Tacitus himself. Rather than adding another to the numerous assessments, ancient and modern, of Livy's style, I'm just going to here offer a close reading of a single passage from the 4th decade, the attack of Antiochus III of Syria on the Thessalian town of Larissa in the year 192, and his activities in winter of 191. We read the following. These operations were completed within 10 days. of his reaching Pherae. He then set out to Cranon with his entire army and took it immediately on arrival. Next, he seized Chierium and Metropolis and the strongholds surrounding them, so that the whole of that region, except Atrox and Girto, was now under his control. He thereupon decided to attack Larissa, thinking that the inhabitants would not remain stubborn any longer because of the fear inspired by the storming of the other towns, or his kindness in releasing the garrison, or the example of so many states surrendering themselves. He ordered the elephants to be driven before the standards to inspire panic, and advanced on the city in square formation, causing the spirits of a large section of the Larussians to waver uncertainly between the immediate fear of the enemy and respect for their absent allies. In the course of these days, Amenander, with his young Athameneian troops, seized Palanaeum, and Menippus, with 3,000 Aetolian infantry and 200 cavalry, marched into Perhybia, forcibly seized Meloia and Kereticae, and ravaged the territory of Tripolis. After speedily accomplishing this, they returned to Larissa to the king, and came upon him as he sought counsel on what he should do about Larissa. Opinions there varied. Some proposed the use of force and no postponement of a simultaneous attack from all sides with siege works and engines against the walls of a city set on level ground, exposed on all sides over the level plain. Others argued now that the city's strength was in no way comparable to that of the Pheraeans, now that winter and the time of year were suited to no war operations, least of all to blockading and attacking cities. As the king wavered between hope and fear, the chance arrival of ambassadors from Pharsalus, who had come to surrender their city, raised their spirits. In the meantime, Marcus Baebius had met Philip in the country of the Desarirati, and as a result of the agreement of the two, he sent Appius Claudius to the defense of Larissa, and he came by forced marching through Macedonia to the ridge of mountains which lies above Goni. The town of Goni is 20 miles from Larissa, situated at the very entrance to the defile which they call Tempe. When he had laid out a camp too large in proportion to the size of his force, and built more fires than were necessary for practical purposes, he created in the enemy the impression he had desired, that the whole Roman army with King Philip was there. So the king, using as a pretext to his men the approach of winter, delayed only one day and retired from Larissa, and withdrew to Demetrius, another town in Greece, and the Aetolians and Athamenes returned to their own countries. Although Appius saw that the siege had been raised, which had been the purpose of his coming, he yet went down to Larissa to reassure the minds of the allies for the future. And there was double joy, both because the enemy had left their country and because they saw a Roman garrison within their walls. From Demetrius, the king went to Chalcis, having fallen in love with a young woman of Chalcis, the daughter of Cleoptolemus. And when he had worn her father out, first by sending messengers, then by personal requests delivered verbally, the father being reluctant to entangle himself in a match which promised too great difficulties, at length he gained his point, and as if in the midst of peace, he celebrated his nuptials, and for the rest of the winter, forgetful of the magnitude of the two tasks he had undertaken, the Roman war and the liberation of Greece, laying aside the responsibility for everything, he engaged in banquets and the delights which follow wine, and then, from weariness rather than satiety of these pleasures, he gave himself over to sleep. This same habit of easy living seized all the king's prefects who were in command of the winter camps everywhere, especially in Boeotia. The soldiers, too, fell into the same way of life, nor did one of them put on his armor, or walk his post, or perform sentinel duty, or do anything else which pertained to the tasks and duties of a soldier. Now, this extract falls neatly into two parts. Antiochus's attack on Larissa in Greece, together with the Roman response, followed by the king's retreat and his marriage. On the one hand, the parts have distinct and contrasting settings. The one has a self-contained story of a military action, the other a brief, equally self-contained anecdote about a king's leisure. On the other hand, The military narrative is not definitively separated from the following domestic scene. The information that the campaign season was ending is provided obliquely in two reported remarks. We get the word hiemen, that is winter, and hiemen instare, that is winter began. So unobtrusive a transition from campaign to winter quarters is not unparalleled in Livy, but he more often chooses to delineate the stages of an action, or the shift from one to another, explicitly. In this extract that I've given you, um, uh, we see the example of intra decimum die perfectis, that is, within 10 days, having done all of this within 10 days. And we also see per eos dies, through the same days, and interim, which means meanwhile. We are therefore encouraged to read the military and domestic parts of this extract as forming some sort of unity. What ties them together, you might ask? Well, it is really the character of Antiochus himself. We first see him taking Chronon by storm immediately upon arriving, primo adventu. Then several other towns he also seizes in quick succession. Such rapid conquest is one of the conventional marks of an ideal general in Roman historiography, and this therefore identifies the king as a force to be reckoned with. As he approaches the town of Larissa, however, his motivation for attacking is detailed by Livy in what is called a ratus period, that is, a clause governed by the participle ratus, thinking that, reckoning that. This is a common device for getting inside a character's head. We see it here, but we see it in many places throughout Livy's narrative. Antiochus's shrewd surmise of why the Laricians might surrender revolves around the notions of mutual favor. He has done them a beneficium, a kindness, which they will feel bound to return. And they also might want to surrender because of precedent. They will deduce from what happened to other towns already captured by Antiochus that resistance is futile. Or, a third possibility, they will copy the example of the people around them who are surrendering. That is, they will either avoid or imitate the exempla available to them. In counting on Larissa's looking to the fate of its neighbors, Livy's Antiochus may be imitating the later Julius Caesar, the greatest general of them all, of course, who in his own work on the Civil War, the Bellum Civile, Book 3, chapters 80 through 81, he relates how several towns in this same part of Thessaly in northern Greece surrendered to him after he sacked one that resisted. So there might be a little playful echo here. The one town that did not surrender, that is Larissa, in Livy, was also the same one that is the focus here. And Caesar tells us that is the one town of his that did not surrender in Book 3, as I said, chapter 81. This is in line 2. Larissa, however, does waver. We hear words like they are incerti, that is, they are uncertain. Intermetum et verecundiam, between fear and kind of awe or reverence, respect. However, at this moment, Livy shifts the narrative to another part of Greece, reporting on the contemporaneous victories of Antiochus's lieutenants. Timed to coincide with the deliberations of the townspeople, the narrative breaks open a hole in the Syrian king's apparently successful enterprise. Though the focus returns to Larissa, along with Amminander and Menippus, Antiochus has lost narrative control. He is now object, not subject. Even linguistically, we see ad regum rediunt. They return to the king. And in a couple of awkward sentences, perhaps mirroring the jolt that we as readers feel, his subordinates find the king himself trying to decide what to do. His indecision is communicated to his advisors. Some counsel one thing, others do counsel another thing, and as the sentence opens up into a long appended appellative absolute in the Latin, it is further divided into parts. At the end of the council, Far from having resolved the issue, the king, like the Lauricians, and in similar words, wavers. He is incerto inter spem metumque. He is uncertain, kind of hovering between hope and fear. However, again, the situation alters. In the midst of Antiochus's doubt comes the report of Pharsalus's surrender, brought by legates who arrive, forte, by chance. Forte often serves to mark a convenient coincidence that in turn triggers a decisive event. For example, Brutus returns forte to Rome at the same moment as Lucretia's husband and father go to answer her call of distress. This is in Book 1 of Livy, chapter 58. And it is Brutus, of course, who, as a result of her rape, will take the initiative in expelling the kings of Rome. Forte is a narrative clue that suggests significant action, therefore. However, here the king's new courage is immediately thwarted as Livy breaks off the narrative a second time. The scene to which he switches with interim, meanwhile, involves not the king's allies, but the Romans, who come to Larissa's rescue. Despite the fact that not to be fooled is an essential characteristic of the ideal general, Appius's fairly conventional ruse with the extra campfires and the extra large military camp deceives Antiochus, who then subsequently retreats. Both the enemy's departure and the enclosing within the walls of the Roman Praesidium are closural gestures. The former putting an end to the siege, the latter a literal rounding off. And by the time we come to that rounding off, the narrative focus has shifted entirely. The attack, unusually for Livy, who likes to show the reactions of those inside a besieged town, was one, with one exception, told from the point of view of the aggressors. However, at the end, events are focalized by the townspeople. Then we can say, in conclusion, in a sense, Antiochus has lost a textual battle, as well as having to abandon a real one. The episode's coda, the account of the king's marriage at Chalcis, reprises its main themes. Antiochus appears here in the same light as he did in the battle narrative. He leaves one town and approaches another. He is seized by desire and makes a finely judged attack on a wavering enemy. This time he is successful. However, that success is no better managed than his siege of Larissa. Though he takes the initiative, he is in fact not in charge, but is captured from the start. He spends the winter as if in peacetime, forgetful of his business as king. And his entire army, commander and soldier alike, do the same. This is a display of bad judgment, and it reflects and helps explain Antiochus's previous military failure, albeit in abbreviated form. The attack, which will have lasted a relatively short time, takes nearly 4 times as long to tell it as does the winter the relation we get about the winter. Livy's compression, therefore, produces at least one remarkable effect. The description of the king's activities must indicate repeated feasting. That is, he handed the remainder of the winter over to sleep. This indicates a kind of continual repeating of these sort of lounging about of feasting and indulgence. And this presumably interspersed with other activities, but it would have lasted over the course of several months. But the only possible hint of this duration of lasting for several months is the imperfect tense of the verb celebrabat. That is, he continued to celebrate. Now, Latin as a language regularly uses the imperfect for subordinate actions and a kind of aorist perfect, that is a completed action, traduxit here, he handed over, for the primary action. Therefore, in this sentence, the imperfect may have little continuative force, and the last words, in somno traduxit, he gave him the rest of the winter over to sleep, give the impression that Antiochus passed his winter all at once, in one moment of drunken, sated sleep. For the experienced reader of history, the closing detail that Antiochus indulged in his pleasures to exhaustion rather than repletion, satiety, identifies him as the opposite of a good general, since the latter takes only what he needs of sleep and no more. Our final glimpse of Antiochus, then, is as someone precisely the opposite of the man implied by his vigorous entrance at the beginning of this passage. So far, then, this close reading shows us a deceptively simple narrative in which we are led to form an opinion about Antiochus that conflicts with our first impression of him as a decisive, praiseworthy commander. To see how the Latin itself works, however, we have to look more closely. In discussing style, scholars generally consider four areas: diction, the words used, especially with regard to how choice they are, that is a word archaic, is a word innovative, or otherwise unusual. Another category is syntax, that would be the arrangement of the words into clauses, the grammar of it all. A third category is sentence structure. Are sentences long or short, simple or complex? And lastly, the fourth category of style, we might say, are figures of speech, special ways of using language, either to produce artistic sounds like rhyme or poetic effects through tropes such as simile, metaphor, metonymy. Ancient writers thought carefully about these sort of things while composing, since the choices they made in each area would determine what sort of literary work they produced. Historians of Rome had to narrate a great many battles, so a conventional vocabulary, which is on display most clearly in the commentary of Julius Caesar, for instance, gradually grew up for such descriptions. Livy's narratives of military action borrow techniques from Caesar's commentaries, often imitating what has been called communique style, that is, terse, telegraphic language, in which dispatches from a legate to his commander or the Senate might have been couched. Other conventional elements include the capture of a city, primo adventru, right at his first arrival, that we saw here in this passage, the advance in square formation, quadrato agmine, and the forced march, magnis itineribus. All of these were found frequently in war narratives from Caesar on down. Similarly, the most formulaic language used to effect a transition from one part of the story to the next, his perfectis, perfectus, that is, with these things having been done, he set out, plus an accusative of the place he's going to. Per eostem dies, that is, throughout these same days. His raptem peractis, with these things having been done immediately. These are all abundant, though not exclusive to military narratives. However, this style is mixed with language that looks conventional, but which in fact seems to be made up of Livy's own invented military cliches. So, for example, propositum signum, the setting up of a signal, motum certamen, the fight that has been set in motion, and proelium omittere, to abandon a battle, are all found either first or exclusively in Livy. And they occur inside a couple of pages, actually, in Book 6, chapters 12 through 13 of Livy. The effect is one of slightly unbalanced familiarity. This is military language, obviously, but not as we know it. Military expressions in our extract that I've been looking at for our purposes right now include the jingle obsidione atque appugnatione, which is by a besiege and by siege and attack. This is a combination of nouns found only in Caesar and in Livy. If the speaker intends them as near synonyms, as they often appear to be, then this is an illustration of what is sometimes called by scholars the fullness of expression, the copia verborum. And it is a characteristic sometimes affected by Livy. For instance, tautologist phrases like hiemem et tempus anni, the winter and time of the year, that one sees in Book 10, Chapter 8, and operibus ac machinis in Book 10, Chapter 7, that is, with siege engines and other kinds of siege engines. this particular phrase actually apparently is particularly a Livian expression. Both opera and machinae or machinationes, machinamata, these both designate siege works. The former a general, the latter a more specific type. And outside of Livy, their combination is found only in one Flavian writer, that is Frontinus, and slightly modified in Tacitus's Histories, Book 4, Chapter 28, Machinas molemque operum. Apart from these military expressions, the diction is in this extract that we've been looking at. It actually contains a surprising number of choice elements for such a short, not obviously written up passage. That is kind of laboriously worked up passage. Unusual language includes the emotive combination of incertus and fluctuare, that is to be uncertain and to be fluctuating, supervenire, which to come upon. Otherwise, primarily, it is a work that first appears in Virgil's Eclogues, Eclogue 6, line 20, and is a poetic kind of coinage, perhaps. But it is found also in Livy. Also the phrase non differendum quin, that is not knowing the difference, or not doubting but that. This is found almost exclusively in Livy, and other ones as well. Fauces saltus, perhaps borrowed from the Republican tragedian Accius, whose fragments have the only extant example of this phrase before Livy. Amore captus, captured by love, which is definitely a poetic phrase. Celebrare, of a wedding, to celebrate. This is first used in prose by Livy. And effusi in luxuriam, to kind of be diffused into degeneracy or into wantonness. Or really, it's really kind of used in a middle voice sense to diffuse into degeneracy. So kind of using a passive verb there with an active meaning. There is a particularly striking use of the preposition ad to mean in, also in Livy, in this passage, which usually means at, and this may be colloquial and seems to be the reason why it is almost confined to Livy in literary Latin. So the rich texture imparted by all this vocabulary is further enhanced by a kind of style that is often found in Livy that is known as variatio, or deliberate variation, and consequent play with the reader's expectation. This is a technique associated above all with Tacitus that we'll be looking at soon. But Livy uses it subtly, producing a slight imbalance in his prose that makes the reader kind of work. For example, there are actually 4 examples in this passage that we've just looked at. This kind of deliberately frustrated parallelism with phrases like intermetum praesentum hostium et verecundum absentium sociorum, that is, between the present fear of the enemy and and respect of their absent allies. You see, here we have transferred the epithet praesens that was in the first clause was used for the enemy. That is referring to the metum praesentum, the present fear of the enemy. But then Livy kind of transfers that adjective noun pair and upsets the otherwise exact correspondence between the two halves of the prepositional phrase by having it be put into the referring to the allies in the second half of it. So not referring to the verecundiam, that is to the respect or reverence, but rather to the absent allies. Likewise, the varied construction of the modifiers of urbis, the extremely unusual joining together by the conjunction et of a participle to a cum clause, metatus et cum accendisset, and the use of cernere, to discern, to view, in 2 different senses within the same sentence, Kernebat, he realized, and Kernebant, they saw physically. In his structural artistry, his syntax and arrangement, Livy again demonstrates a varied technique. Much of the scene at Larissa is told simply, with little complex subordination. The sentence in which Antiochus's lieutenants come upon him is particularly remarkable for its repetition of the town's name, a repetition perhaps caused by Livy's use of parataxis, that is, the avoidance of hierarchical syntax. There is plenty of decoration, however, in word order, including several tricola, groups of 3 items, often of increasing length, though not always. This is, for instance, in the phrases vel terrore, vel beneficio, vel exemplo, and again citae, adutu, in which the central item aperta is significantly shorter than the others. Also, in conviviis earum, groups of 2 elements are also found. Latius quam pro, plures quam quot, primo deinde, where the structure is emphasized by the rhyme of allegando and rogando. Hyperbaton also is used, that is, the artistic dislocation of expected word order, and it is found twice in this passage, where the resulting word order mirrors the enemy retreat within their territory. In suos se receperunt fines, they withdrew into their own borders, and also where luxuria is postponed from its natural position next to eadem to the end of its clause to allow it to interact also with in eandem. Put it all together, writing history is a complicated business, not least because according to the canons of ancient historiography, one was expected to make one's characters speak as well as act. Livy, who was famous in antiquity for his speeches, used both reported speech, oratio obliqua, and direct discourse, oratio recta, throughout his work. Though I'm not going to be looking at any direct speech here, there is reported speech in this extract that we've been looking at, notably in the deliberations of Antiochus and his lieutenants. And therefore, this short section illustrates the kind of sentence that Livy tends to write in imitation of real speech, that is, the kind of speech that one might actually hear from an orator or in a Senate session. Its structure is quite rangy, beginning with a simple main clause, as a heading, opinions varied, then branching off into parallel ablative absolutes, aliis consentibus, aliis memorantibus. And this, where he is reporting the advice given by different groups. The second clause is longer and subdivided into 2 different parts, both beginning with the word nunc now. Each ablative absolute has an extension following its main verb, the present participle. With the sentence, when it is given, it gives us a lot of information. It describes rather than narrates. Nothing actually happens aside from our hearing the words of the king's advisors. The situation, though, is quite different in the latter part of the passage where it describes the king's luxuria, his degeneracy. This period, this sentence, that is also hypotactic. It is characterized by subordination rather than coordination. And it is otherwise radically different from the one that I've just given an analysis of. Here, Livy narrates a sequence of actions, from Antiochus's leaving Demetrios to his arrival at Chalcis, his falling in love, his wooing and wedding, and his behavior during the winter. It is a typical historiographical period in which each verbal unit, participle, cum clause, ablative absolute, indicative verb, all represent a different stage in the action. The forward-moving narrative units are punctuated by these words: profectus, coptus, fatigaset, impetrata, celebrabat, oblitus, traduxit. There is grammatical subordination, but no real subordination of thought. With its 2 indicative verbs, the sentence further illustrates one of the 2 chief types of narrative purative, in which one sequence of subordinate clauses plus an indicative verb is followed by a second, joined to the first by and by the word and, or in some cases the word but, as if the sentence had started again. Livy tends to pack his narrative periods very full, therefore. And in this one, the skeleton of forward-moving units is elaborated by other verbs, which indeed, instead of moving the story ahead, function descriptively. The pair of gerunds detailing how Antiochus wore the father down, elegantem, of the action that the father resists, omissa, expanding oblitus, and the tricolon of activities in which the king spends the winter. A discussion of Livy by Karl Galinsky in 1996 in his great work on Augustan culture stresses Livy's openness. He says, quote, "What makes Livy an Augustan author is not a fixed ideology, but his constant formulation and reformulation of some of the central ideas of his age," end quote. And among these are reckoned a concern with moral decay and the need for regeneration, patriotism, the value of the past for the transforming of the present, and the realization, quote again from Galinsky, that permanence incorporates evolution and change, end quote. These are all major preoccupations of the Augustan period. That is the period of Augustus when Livy wrote around the end of the very first century BC and the beginning of the first century AD. Many of these are ideas on which that I've already touched, and my close reading of the Antiochus episode allows us to go further with this same kind of more thematic approach. Livy took seriously the ancient notion that language mirrors reality. The world of Rome, as Livy builds it, sometimes looks simple, old-fashioned, full of good old Roman virtues, full of good old Romans doing good old Roman kind of things. But to make that the only takeaway would be a mistake. At a fundamental level, the present and the past are inextricably entwined. Both linguistically, archaisms and neologisms appear in the same sentence. Real cliches and invented ones combine in a single description, and also thematically. This variety, which is also very Augustan, does more than sustain the breadth and movement of the work. Like the style of Sallust that we've already analyzed, and like the style of Tacitus that we will analyze, it reflects the world as Livy saw it, and as he wants you to see it too. For example, it is often pointed out that Livy's ancient Rome, even as far back as the monarchic period, is working through the same kinds of political and social issues as the late Republican and early Augustan periods. Though he was well aware of historical change, Livy uses this overlay of historical periods to suggest ways in which, through close observation of past events, we can find ways of approaching present problems. We see both what ancient Rome was like and what implications and what implications problems and challenges like our own may have for the construction of our character and our identity. There is a complex layering, therefore, of audiences in the Ab Urbe Condita. We, readers, read and watch the events, but within the text as well, people observe the deeds both of their contemporaries. For instance, in Book 1, the famous Battle of the Herati, the Romans and Albans watched the battle between the Herati and Curiatii. In Book 6, Chapter 20, the plebs watched the trial of Manlius Capitolinus. In Book 21, Chapter 42, Hannibal's soldiers watched the prize fight he stages before the battle at the Ticinus. And there is also, within Livy's text, um, people watching in the sense of their own ancestors, people that were related to them in stories and exempla, and symbolized by monuments that the Romans themselves were looking back upon. At each level, we and they are invited to see exactly how the past can be useful and how the present can be negotiated. This world in which the expected and the paradoxical combine in one, in which conventional sources and forms of authority cannot always be taken for granted, is one in which the republic that Livy shows us is, in the surviving books, with its predictable annual rotations and its expanding power, shadowed always by the knowledge given to us in the preface that this monumental Rome is collapsing and indeed has already collapsed, as he said in his preface in line 9. And as if to keep this here and now firmly in our mind, Livy makes Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, the man who perhaps most of all represents the present, appear already, though only briefly, in the very early books. He is first mentioned as a peacekeeper who has shut the doors of the temple of Janus. This is in Book 1, Chapter 19. He appears a second time in Book 4, Chapter 20, as both an innovator and a follower of tradition, the founder and restorer of all temples. In Book 4, however, Livy is primarily interested in Augustus as a source of historical information, reporting the princeps' discovery of evidence proving that Aulus Cornelius Cossus was consul when he dedicated the spolia opima, the choice or rich spoils, in the year 437. But the way in which he introduces the princeps' testimony into his narrative is disconcerting, to say the least. Livy first appears to accept Augustus's report in Book 4, Chapter 20, then to cast doubt in it, only a few lines later, then to deny that any certainty is possible, only a few lines after that, and finally to return to trusting the inscription Augustus claimed to discover. When this passage is read in the larger context of the surrounding narrative, however, it seems that Livy does in fact reject Augustus's information. This would be Book 4, Chapter 32. He says, quote, "Thus the author has succeeded in." This is a commentary on Livy about this passage. Quote, "Thus the author has succeeded in acknowledging Augustus's personal authority generously and uncompromisingly, while at the same time undermining it." End quote. Part of what is going on here is Livy's assertion of his own competence as a historian. Augustus may have been ruler, but Livy was the scholar. The context, however, of the discussion is important. The spolia opima comprised the armor of an enemy leader killed by a Roman general who was endowed with imperium and who had been fighting under his own auspices. At the time of writing, the rank of the previous dedicators was of immediate political relevance, as Augustus had just blocked Marcus Licinius Crassus's claim to have the right to make a similar dedication, basing his refusal on the fact that Crassus was not fighting under his own auspices and did not have the same status, therefore, as his three predecessors. It is consequently inescapable that inciting Augustus only to disagree with him, however generously, Livy is declaring his independence from the wider political authority that the princeps could potentially wield even in the sphere of literature. Though the emperor and the historian seem to have shared many elements of a moral and social program, Livy was fundamentally detached from politics. Detached but not dispassionate. Livy's concern with moral regeneration involves him in investigation and criticism of aristocrats and plebeians alike, of Rome's behavior toward foreigners, and of their problematic influence on Rome, of leaders and of the led alike. If that is the case, which it is, then we need to ask what kind of authority Livy claims. We know very little about the real Livy, but who is the author who is implied in the pages of the Ab Urbe Condita? His most striking characteristic, evident from the very first words of the preface and displayed throughout the text thereafter, is a kind of arrogant deference. The first thing we hear is his wondering if his project will be worthwhile. Yet that project is one that would take him a lifetime and 142 books. It was a history on a scale never achieved yet in either Greek or Latin. He says he will console himself if his name is obscured by the nobility of those who will put him in the shade. Yet there is a remarkable accumulation of first-person verbs in the preface, and his history as a whole opens with the foundation first of Padua, which is Livy's birthplace, and only secondly of the settlement in Latium that would eventually lead to Rome. This is Book 1, Chapter 1. And as one reads through Livy's text, we meet, quote-unquote, Livy frequently. He keeps us on our moral and ethical toes. He invites us to read an episode in a particular way. He praises or blames the people whose deeds he records. He uses speeches to open debate on important political and social issues. He helps us read history. He tells us whether a story is plausible or not. He alerts us to conflicts among his sources over a name, over a date, or the way something happened. He explains that some kinds of evidence are by nature unreliable. He insists that one of a historian's duties is to report tradition, whether believable or not. Finally, he pushes us to use the monument, guiding us physically and intellectually through this city, pointing out where contemporary Rome bears traces of ancient Rome in an inscription or a significant place, or showing us where and how an older custom or belief is different from today's. More challenging still, though, Livy invites his readers to participate in evaluating the past by confronting us repeatedly with situations that are difficult, sometimes impossible to resolve or to judge. In the words of one critic from about 30 years ago, quote, "The narrator's own uncertainty, confusion, and conspicuous arbitrariness serve to dramatize the logic of his argument that a confident determination of historical fact is beyond reach," end quote. What he substitutes for such confidence is the repeated demand that we examine and test our assumptions about Roman identity as constructed by Roman tradition. As a professional scholar, a non-participant in the political and military world he describes, Livy risked and still risks having his authority questioned, even dismissed. It is possible, however, to read his deferential approach, his professions of insecurity and doubt, both as guarantees of his reliability, analogous in some ways to modern-day footnotes, and as a pose, also, that enables him to question, even partially to subvert the Rome he is trying to amend. However, subversion is only part of the picture. As C.B.R. Pelling has recently stressed, critics tend to look only for ways in which a text challenges its readers' beliefs and assumptions. There are other possible models, however. Building on general studies of the meaning and nature of propaganda, Andrew Wallace Hedrill and others have shown that one of the principal and perhaps unconscious concerns of the Augustan writers was to make sense of Augustus and his new world by inscribing them into the values and traditions with which those writers were familiar. In some ways, this was very difficult, since Augustus represented a break with the past. But a continual testing of the possibility and success of contemporary experiments in art, in politics, and in social reform does not necessarily mean a rejection of those experiments. Augustus worked and succeeded by a process of trial and error. He succeeded as well by blending innovation with tradition, presenting new, often radical ideas as incarnations of the old. We have seen in our discussion that Livy similarly mixes the old with the new, producing a history that has an unmistakable thematic and ideological coherence. The Ab Urbe Condita is at once a criticism and a celebration of Rome, a text which both affirms and questions the traditions on which the city was built and with which it may rebuild itself. Thank you.